Welcome to Chapter 9, Industrialization of the North. So we've talked a little about industrialization before, and some of this will be a refresher, but I wanted to go over it again because it's important to what we're going to pick up on in Chapter 9. First of all, as we're starting Chapter 9, before we get into industrialization, we have two systems of getting products. We have skilled artisans who are craft workers who are highly skilled and trained in what they make. And then we have something called the putting out system. It was the alternate, it was the alternate to the artisans. And these people also produced goods by hand. So they were similar because the putting out system and the artisans both produced goods by hand. They were different though in that the artisans were skilled craft workers, and the putting out system, you really only had to be good at one thing. So let's say it might take several different people to create one product. In the example of shoes, one person or family might cut the soles, another person or family might cut the upper part of the shoe, and another part would actually stitch them together. So in this way, the work was put out to the community to do each segment of work. The goods were cheaper through the putting out system because they weren't made by artisans. They were made by people who had relatively low skills but could do the one job that they had to do in order to create the product. So now, Chapter 9 brings us into the rise of manufacturing. In Great Britain in the early 1800s, they had the most advanced factories, and they even banned immigration of mechanics to keep that technology there. Great Britain wanted to hang on to that so that they could keep that technology for them and they wouldn't share it. No one else could have it. It would make them securely the country that had the most advanced factories and therefore the best commerce. Samuel Slater was a British mechanic who did travel to the United States, and he became founder of the first really successful cotton mill in the U.S. Jefferson's embargo on British goods made the U.S. citizens invest more in industry. So, we talked about that in the last chapter. The embargo on British goods meant that the U.S. either had to learn to do without the goods that they had been getting from Great Britain, or they had to get creative and make those themselves. And that's what happened. The U.S. people started investing in industry, and that's why it started to grow. The embargo of 1807 kept U.S. merchants from Atlantic trade, which is what we just talked about. They had to start producing their own goods. Then the War of 1812 also impacted American manufacturing because it created financial problems that hurt U.S. businesses. So and many of them turned to manufacturing just in order to survive. One of these was Francis Cabot Lowell, and he had been to Great Britain and he had toured some factories and he remembered their setup and he memorized the way that they operated. So when he came back to the United States, he created a power loom factory that replaced hand weaving. And that wasn't the only thing Lowell is known for. Lowell and in another town, Waltham, Massachusetts, Lowell established an early textile mill and pretty much built a community around it. These kind of pop-up industrial towns became centers for women's factory work. So early mills were built near water for hydropower, but electricity changed all that and they made all towns level playing ground for industry. Lowell's idea was to give people who weren't working an opportunity to work, and the biggest group of non-working people in America at that time was young women. So by creating these factory jobs for women, it gave them an opportunity to work, it gave them an opportunity to live outside the house, and it gave them options to marriage. So at this time, life for a woman would have been, living at home, maybe studying at home, and getting married. So now she has an opportunity to develop friendships outside of the home, and she has an opportunity for education, to work, and to earn her own money, which gives her an option to marriage. Workers gained appreciation for their work, but they also began questioning the fairness of industrial order. So that's important too. We'll talk a little more about the town structure in a moment, like right now. So the thing about Lowell, Massachusetts, Lowell knew when he created this factory with a women-based workforce that he would need to guarantee family members that the women would be safe alone and in this factory environment. So he set up boarding houses with chaperones for these women. These boarding houses had strict rules. They worked 12-hour days, and during work, talking was forbidden. There was to be no swearing and no drinking of alcohol, and church attendance was required. If you broke any of those rules, you were kicked out and your job was given to someone else, another woman who was waiting for an opportunity to get out of her house. Many farm families sent their daughters there to work, and it really opened up new opportunities for women. Now, don't think for a minute that they were making great wages. That doesn't come until later. So, the results of mechanization, it obviously increased the output of goods that were available to be sold. It also lowered prices since mechanization made production less expensive. We had the artisans who were skilled in the work and their products were top dollar. The putting out system decreased that because they didn't have to be skilled. And now we have machinery that's coming into play that is taking the place of some of this work that people would do. And so because of that, then the prices become less expensive. There was an increase in textile factories across New England. Before the Civil War began, there were 878 textile factories, employing more than 100,000 people. And ultimately, they produced more than 940 yards of cloth. So obviously, the success of textile mills in New England meant that there would be textile mills popping up everywhere else too. There were other factories that were coming into vogue at this time too, like shoe factories, leather tanning, paper making, gun making, clock making, which was very labor intensive as an artisan and in the putting out system, and then flour milling also. Lower prices plus more product available to be purchased brought about the rise of consumerism. Basically, more people could simply afford to purchase things. Goods and services, the goods that people were producing, were no longer seen as luxury items, like oil lamps. Oil lamps were brighter than candles, and now that they could be mass-produced, they were affordable. More people could buy them. Also affordable now, parlor stoves. So those were used for heating and replaced the old fireplace. Cook stoves also made a big difference in the family life. Cook stoves had multiple burners, so a woman could cook more. So she didn't have to spend all day cooking one thing at a time. She could kind of cook in a shorter length of time because she had more burners to cook with. Also coming about at this time, carpet, furniture, and wallpaper. All of those were affordable, and just about anyone could get their hands on them. This new work experience, though, meant some changes in way of life. For instance, previously, farmers and artisans could control their own time. And so as they continued working farms and doing their craft work, then they could control their own time. But factory jobs demanded a lot of time. There were strict work times in factories where farmers and artisans could decide, maybe the farmer decides that on Monday he's going to plant, and on Tuesday he's going to, work on the equipment, something like that. And then if he wanted to switch those up, he could. Factory work was not like that. It was very strict. You had to be there at a certain time. You had to work at least 12-hour days for the most part. And then there was this practice of unfair pay docking. So if an employee showed up 5 minutes late, the employer could take off several hours to punish them for being late. So things weren't exactly great in the factory at this time. They also had 6-day work weeks. So these people are working 72 hours a week on average. So as people will do, they're producing more. So now they're trying to decide, can I produce as much with fewer people? Can I have one person do more jobs on the assembly line and still have the same production that I do? So by trying to have fewer people to do more work, sometimes that led to accidents. The problem with that is, today, if you have an accident on the job, you have insurance, you have disability insurance. I mean, you have some reinforcement there in case you lose your income for a period of time. But at this time, when factories were just starting, there wasn't anything like that. So if you, I don't know, got your hand caught in machinery and you had to be off work for 2 weeks, then you were just off work for 2 weeks. If you lost the opportunity to work for good because of your accident, then your family just didn't have the money anymore. You lost your income and your ability to work. And wages were low at the time too. $300 per year for men. Women would have made less than that. And it took $600 a year to take care of a family of 5. I know what you're thinking. Wow, $300 a year for men, and it only took $600 for a family of 5. But keep in mind the living conditions at the time too, and the necessities that we have now that are really mostly convenience for us. But even just in my lifetime, I think I mentioned it in class one day, I found my father's W-2 form from 1974, and it was for $6,900. I mean, for a full year, $6,900. We were a family of 4. We had a new car. We had a new house. My brother had all of the guitar lessons he wanted. I had piano lessons. I mean, we were a classic middle class family on $6,900 a year. My mom didn't work. It wasn't like she was supplementing the income. So things change. Time changes. Cost of living changes. Trust me on that. Okay, let's talk a little about the labor movement. So when these women moved away from home to go to work in these factories, they're working 12 hours a day. They really don't have a lot of time to talk when they're at work, but they do start to form these bonds in these boarding houses. And so, as people will do, they get together and they start to complain a little bit, or they start to question the way things are operated. And that's what happened here. So these women began to protest conditions and pay at work. They formed the Lowell Factory Girls Association to organize strikes and fight wage cuts. They also then later formed the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association to protest the 12-hour workday. Strikes were rarely successful at this point in time because they're not unionized at this point. They are starting to form organizations, though, and to speak up for themselves, which was the first step. So there were some critics of industrialization. There were those who favored it. People were moving into towns. They were getting some work. Women, obviously, like we've been talking about, had an opportunity that they'd never been given before. But there were still critics of industrialization. The big one, was that the factory owners were the ones making all the big profits and that the workers hardly had anything. The labor theory of value proposed that the value of a product should accurately reflect the labor needed to produce it. That the workers, there's a spelling error on the slides. You guys overlooked that. The workers should receive a distribution of profit. It's easy for you to say. Okay. The workers should receive a distribution of profits proportionate to their work. So basically, that would be today how we would develop the cost of an item that we'd produced. So at this point, they're saying that the value of that product should reflect all the labor needed to produce it, and that workers should receive part of that distribution of profits. The Working Men's Party was developed and organized by Thomas Skidmore. They protested the exploitation of workers, they wanted to end debtors' prison, and they wanted equality for all workers. Also at this time, we have public domain land going up for sale. This is land sold by the federal government that belongs to the federal government. The first time we see this, the Land Law of 1796 was based on the Ohio Territory. The U.S. sold 640 acre parcels for $2 per acre. And the land law of 1800 then reduced the minimum parcel size by half and set up sales on credit to encourage farmers to move to the Northwest Territory. And this credit is going to be important as we start talking about the Panic of 1819. So when state banks wouldn't lend money to farmers to get this public land, the government created more state banks to meet demand. Kentucky alone created 46 additional banks. So that resulted in too much money floating around, and the money then was worthless. I mean, there's too much money there and no gold or silver to back it. Land prices skyrocketed. So during the War of 1812, the Bank of the U.S. had suspended payments of the hard money, the gold, the silver coinage. If clients demanded their specie, which is the gold, silver coinage, the bank would crash. So the paper money was worthless. It was the gold and silver that really mattered. And the banks didn't have enough of it to support the paper money that was floating around. The Second Bank of the U.S. made a lot of risky loans and created a bigger inflation problem. This Panic of 1819 was the country's first economic depression. Also in this time period, we have transportation improving. The Cumberland Road was one of the first. The construction started in 1811. It was this national highway that was built from Maryland to Illinois. The feds built the road, but local and state governments built turnpikes or toll bridges on it. So it was a great foundation for states to build upon to start building their highway systems as well. The Erie Canal was also built during this time, and it linked the Hudson River, New York, and the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Valley. This really helped decrease shipping cost and travel time to the west. And the Wabash and Erie Canal, which was built in the early 1840s, at 450 miles is the longest canal in North America. Railroads also had play in this time period. In the late 1820s, steam engines started to compete with the horse-drawn. The Mohawk and Hudson Railroad was the first steam locomotive in the U.S., and railroads really started to increase in the mid-1800s. Of course, that was halted by the start of the Civil War. Right before the Civil War started, there were 30,000 miles of railroad track across the United States. This time period also sees the growth of the American middle class. So, growing from enterprising artisans and small merchants, these people begin to see success. They worried that they might fall down into the working class, though, so they worked really hard to stay in the middle. They valued cleanliness, discipline, morality, hard work, education, and good manners. And women worked in the home to care for the children and take care of the house. They did not have jobs outside the home. The working class at this period, the goal was to keep women and children from working, but that didn't always happen. Sometimes it was important for the extra income to come into the family. So at times education took a back seat to work, especially, farming times, that sort of thing where, if children were needed to help harvest, then that's what they did. They helped harvest at the farm. Wives took in additional work like laundry or sewing, cleaned other houses from time to time, and they still enjoyed entertainment, though. It was less expensive entertainment like circuses and taverns and ball games. So that wraps up this look at Chapter 9. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, drop me an email, and we will go from there.